When we're doing astrophotography, there's a lot of things that can go wrong and we can make many mistakes. And usually the consequence of that mistake is not a big deal, right? So maybe we didn't set our guiding properly and so the imaging session that we had last night didn't work out. I have to throw away all of the data. It's frustrating, but it's not the end of the world. Maybe we drove to some dark place and then we forgot one specific piece of equipment and things didn't work out and we just had to get back home, shame, and and it didn't work out. And that's very frustrating, but it's not the end of the world. It's just, let's try again next time. There is one thing, one type of mistake that can really ruin our equipment itself, that has really painful reminder of our mistake, which is not setting your mount limits properly. In which case you can basically stumble upon a situation that looks like what I have here, where I have my mount here with my telescope on the mount, and this is a scenario where, for instance, the mount kept tracking across the meridian. Of course, I put this this situation here manually. This mount is not defective, it's not tracking past the meridian, I have my limits set up properly. But if you didn't have your limits set up properly, this is what could happen, where the camera here at the bottom of the scope is actually hitting one of the knobs that I have on the wedge that holds up the mount. And this can and does absolutely happen. In fact, it has happened to me a while back in the past. This is the result here. You can see this camera has those streaks there. This is the result of a tripod collision between my equipment and a mount. I don't remember which mount I was using when this happened. But what's important to realize is that in this instance, it was completely my fault. And so it's very important to set your mount limits. And it's also very important to understand that even with your mount limits set perfectly, things can still go wrong. And I'll explain why in this video, together with how to set your mount limits properly. And also I have some bad news there because there's not much we can do about that worst case scenario where the mount limits stop working, besides having some kind of hardware fuse that would stop the mount from slewing into your tripod. Anyway, let me put back to a decent position because this is painful for me to watch like that. And let's get to it. Okay, this is much better. By the way, if you're wondering if this camera is the ASI 2600 MC Air, the camera that has both a main imaging chip, a guide chip, and a ZWASI Air control center smashed into one body, yes it is. I'll be doing a first impressions on this camera very soon on the channel. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. While you're going there, make sure to like the video, and if you want to leave a comment about any experiences you've had with mount limits and whether they've ever failed you, let us know down in the comments. If you want to support the channel at no cost to you and you're planning to buy any equipment from like Amazon, Agena, High Point, First Light Optics, etc. If you do so after clicking the links that I have in the description, it will help me out at no cost to you. If you want to help more directly, you can join the channel as a member. That's the join button next to the subscribe button. Or you can join my Patreon. The link is down in the description. You guys, you make the channel possible. Thank you so much for your generosity. So, going back to mount limits, there's basically three types generally of mount limits, although not all of those types are available with every mount. And depending on even how you connect to a given mount, those limits may or may not be available. It can get kind of weird. And there's tons of different cases, so I won't be able to cover, how to set those limits for every single mount on the planet in this video, but it should give you a good idea of what the limits can do. So first, the easiest limit to understand is probably the horizon limit. It's typically set to 0 degrees, and it basically says that the mount will not allow itself to point your telescope to a target that is below the horizon, which kind of makes sense. And if the mount is tracking a target and that target plunges below the horizon, the mount stops tracking at the horizon. It's a very intuitive limit. It makes sense. And you could set that limit when it's available to something like -10 degrees. For whatever reason, you want the mount to be able to keep tracking below the horizon. Not recommended, but sure, why not? Or you could set it to +10 degrees. You don't want the mount to track targets that fall under 10 minutes of altitude above the horizon. That works too, and that's one kind of limit. But typically the default for most mounts is 0, don't point below the horizon and everything's good. You're not getting any collisions that way. Another type of limit that you can set in some mounts, it's an overhead limit, or zenith limit, or altitude limit. It depends on how it's named in the software that is provided with the mount. And it basically says, like, okay, I do not want the mount to point my telescope straight up, like straight up at the zenith. And the definition can change depending on alt-az mounts or equatorial mounts, but for the mounts that I've seen, including equatorial, it's just you can set an area around the zenith that you do not want the mount to point to. And the interest is that if the mount is pointing straight up, then your telescope is also completely vertical. And when a telescope is completely vertical, it might hit some like tripod legs, or it might hit some obstacles that are below the telescope that could cause an issue. For me, I always set that limit to 90 degrees, like I want to be able to point up to 90 degrees of altitude. That means all the way up to the zenith. If you were to set it to like 80 degrees, the mount will only point to targets that are up to 80 degrees of altitude above the horizon. So when you play around with both a horizon limit and an altitude limit, you are simply setting a lower limit of altitude and a higher limit of altitude of targets that the mount is allowed to slew to, or to keep tracking through that particular limit. So those are very intuitive, I think, to understand. And the difficult one to understand, and the most critical one, is the meridian limit. And that, my friend, is very interesting. So let's look at this scenario. Right now, the mount here is pointing to the north celestial pole. So the north celestial pole is in this direction. And the telescope is pointing to the right of the north celestial pole, so it's pointing towards the east. Right? So we have a target in the east that is rising, and the mount can track that target as it moves across the sky. And the target is rising and rising across the sky, so the mount is keeping track of that target. It's going, it's keeping track, it's keeping track. Except that at some point, the target will be at its highest point in the sky. And the highest point in the sky for any given target in a night is at the meridian. The meridian is just a line that connects the north celestial pole to the south celestial pole. But you can see what's happening there. The more we are tracking the target, the more we are moving this telescope towards me, right? And since we're rotating, if we keep rotating too much, we'll end up in a situation that is very similar to what I showed in the beginning of the video. And so that's why we need also meridian limits. And a meridian limit is basically, at its simplest, how many degrees do you allow me to track past the meridian, and you're absolutely sure that it's not gonna make your equipment hit your tripod or hit anything, right? So I can say, like, stop tracking at the meridian, and then we're safe. Or I can say, no, my scope is relatively small, like this one, and there's very little risk of hitting the mount for, let's say, an additional 10 degrees past the meridian. So I can set that up as well. And for this particular mount here, I've set this up to exactly 0 degrees. So as we keep slewing, at some point, I'm actually using my smartphone to do that. At some point, the mount it stopped slewing. I'm still trying to make it slew, but it stopped because it reached the limit that I set there. And it's good that it did, because depending on the target, actually, it is very close to hitting the base that I have here. If I had a target with a different declination, so a target at a slightly different place, so around here, I'm only around 1 inch from hitting the wedge below the mount with the camera. So that's quite bad. And if I let it go past the meridian for another 5 degrees, 10 degrees, I would hit, depending on the declination of the target, I would hit my wedge here. Maybe I would hit the tripod. It really depends on the telescope that I'm using. But that is what a meridian limit does, and it's very important. The problem that comes around is meridian limits, they can be extremely complex to set, especially for some mounts that use the control system called OnStep, like this one does. And also, you need to set your limits in a way that they will play well with the app that you are using to control the mount. Because very often, when a mount hits its limit, it will refuse to move at all anymore. It will refuse to accept a slew setting. Because normally, once you hit this point, you want the control software, after maybe a few minutes, to issue to the mount a go-to command to the target, and then the mount will do a meridian flip so that it will reach to point to the target from the opposite side of my mount here. It's called the side of peer, but it will basically move the telescope to the opposite side and then point to the target. Let me show you how that would look like. You can see now I'm using, that would be an actual slew. It's I'm not simulating any tracking of the target anymore. I'm slewing, and the first part of the slew will be to bring the telescope from the left, from the west side of the mount, to the right, to the east side of the mount. At least for the northern hemisphere. This would look like something like this, right after we've effectively flipped the mount to point to exactly the same target, but from the other side of the mount. And now, to keep track of the target, it will look like this throughout the night. The mount will just rotate around the right ascension axis here, and it will keep track of the target until the target is at the horizon. So that's how it works. The problem being that if, before you've done the flip, the mount has hit its limit, then very often, depending on the mount, depending on the drivers, etc., depending on a lot of things, but the mount will refuse to do the flip. And that can absolutely happen. So you have to make sure that your meridian limits, together with your control software limits, are in sync. So to give you an example, right now I'm in the ASI Air system, connecting to the ASI Air that's within this camera here. And if I go to the mount settings, you'll see that I have my meridian flip settings here. And here I have stop tracking X minutes before meridian. I've set it to 0. This is bad, because if I set it to 0, the mount might hit its limit before the ASI Air realizes that as well, because the ASI Air and the mount might be in a slight disagreement about exactly when the meridian flip occurs, depending on how they compute stuff, and also depending on whether they have the exact same site coordinates in mind. Lots of things can go wrong. So in that case, I want to put some margin there. So I could say like, okay, you want to stop tracking 5 minutes before the meridian. That way, I'm sure that the control system will, on its own, tell the mount to stop tracking before the mount hits its limit. And then I can say autoflip X minutes after meridian. So I can say like, okay, you wait right before the meridian, and then 5 minutes after the meridian, when you know that if you tell the mount to go to the target again, the mount will know, oh yeah, it's on the other side of the meridian now, so I need to do that flip that I did manually for you earlier. So you can see that there is, first, the very important thing about the limit, protecting your equipment, but at the same time, you need to make sure that the way you configure the software that controls your scope, it doesn't conflict with those limits and makes the meridian flip fail. First, we're going to look at how it looks like for the ASCOM driver, so the PC, like Windows version of the driver that controls the ASI AM5 or AM3 mounts. And this is how it looks like. So I have this on my PC that is actually connected to the AM5 mount, and this is the control center. You can access it via like the ASI mount icon that gets installed when you install the ASCOM driver, and you can access the advanced settings here to get all of the information. The interesting bit is here at the bottom. We have the altitude limit setting, and we have the meridian track setting, which is effectively a meridian limit, as we discussed it earlier. So the altitude limit setting, you can turn it on or off. So for me, it's actually off. It's like saying I don't really care, but I could turn it on and say like, okay, I want to allow the mount to track all the way to the zenith by setting it to 90 degrees, or I could say like, no, I want you to point only up to 80 degrees altitude of targets. I don't want to point to the zenith for whatever reason. Like the scope, I have a very long refractor and it might hit the tripod, for instance. So we can do that, right? And for now, I'm just going to go back to 90 degrees and 0 degrees. And the meridian side of things, you can stop tracking before the meridian exactly as is in the SIR effectively. So I could say like, okay, stop tracking 1 degree before the meridian. That's 4 minutes before the meridian. And then in Nina, because I have this limit here that says that I'm going to stop tracking 4 minutes before the meridian or 1 minute before the meridian, that's my limit on the driver side of things. Just to be safe, I want to make sure that I tell Nina or whatever control software I'm using to pause, let's say 5-6 minutes before meridian, to have a little bit of margin there. So the first thing as we go towards the meridian, Nina will stop tracking 6 minutes before, but we have not hit any limit. So we're good, right? And then I can say like between 5 minutes and 10 minutes after the meridian, those two items there. And if we actually stop tracking before the meridian, it's going to be exactly 5 minutes. Then Nina will issue a go to target command to the mount, and that the AM5 will understand like, oh yeah, I need to do the flip, and will because it understands that the target is past the meridian, and then it will point from the other side of the pier as I showed earlier. So that's how the limit works. So this part here is the limit, and then that part here is the actual meridian flip. And those need to be able to, like, you need to have them work together effectively and not against one another, which can happen. And then again, I can stop tracking 4 degrees. So that's 16 minutes roughly after the meridian has been passed, in which case I can go back to Nina and say like, okay, I don't want to pause before the meridian. So it's not going to pause at the meridian, it's going to keep tracking and keep taking exposures. And then between 5 to 10 minutes after the meridian, while Nina is still taking exposures, while the mount is still tracking because it hasn't reached its limit of 4 degrees past the meridian, then we'll keep imaging. And then once we're done with that, and up to 10 minutes after the meridian, Nina will issue the go-to command. And again, it will work exactly the same. The mount sees, oh, my target is past the meridian. I'm getting a go-to to this target, so I'm going to flip the scope to the other side of the pier to point to the target. It's almost magical, and you can see how those two work together. But the real limit here is this stop tracking 4 degrees after the meridian. I am 100% sure that regardless of which target, which declination my telescope is pointed at, if I track 4 degrees past the meridian, my telescope will not hit the tripod, it will not hit anything. That is what I am telling the mount. I'm telling the mount, you're fine with that, this is my limit. And that's what is extremely important. Then you need to make sure that your meridian flip settings agree with that limit. But if the meridian flip settings are wrong, the worst that can happen is that the meridian doesn't happen. So it's not a big deal, you're just losing some imaging time. This thing here, the limit, is the most important. Now let's look at another mount, my Warp Astron WD20 with another driver. And you can see we have the ASCOM driver available here, and we have limits, horizon limits, overhead limits, and then we have meridian east and meridian west. And this is a type of driver called OnStep, and OnStep can get extremely complicated because the meridian limits also define some sort of meridian window. With OnStep mounts, unless you know what you're doing, the best thing to do is to set the meridian limit, both of them, to 0, like I have here. When they're set to 0, it means that the mount will stop tracking at the meridian, right? So we are avoiding any collision with the pier, and you need to make sure that in Nina, in the meridian flip settings, you pause a couple of minutes before the meridian, and then you can do the flip 5 minutes after the meridian. With my UMI 17 Lite mount, which I showed earlier in the video with the red cat, this is the setting and this is what I need to do. With my Warp Astron mount, I can actually set my meridian west because I was able to set the preferred side of pier part of the OnStep program. It's in the hand controller for the mount. In the northern hemisphere, I set it to east, and because of that, I can set my limit to 4 degrees past the meridian. Only if you can set this preferred side of pier should you do that with your OnStep mount. So in the northern hemisphere, your meridian limit is determined by this field, meridian west. In the southern hemisphere, it is determined by meridian east. But those two fields have another purpose in the OnStep drivers. I'm not going to go into the details, but if you want to be absolutely safe, set them to 0. But here, because I have 4 degrees, I can have exactly the same setting that I had earlier for Nina. My meridian flip will work perfectly fine with this limit. Okay, so that's 2 examples that I have in terms of setting the limit, right? So with the OnStep driver or with the AM5 mount, and different drivers like Ioptron will have a different way of doing the same thing. SynScan, so Skywatcher, whether you're using the SynSky driver or the EQ mod driver or the Green Swamp server driver, you have the choice. They have some different ways of setting those limits. But again, you need to remember those meridian limits are extremely important to protect your equipment. At the same time, as I alluded to at the start of the video, they're not enough because they can be deceived. And this is something that can happen easily when we're doing automated astrophotography, because we are pointing our telescope to a part of the sky via a go-to command, and then usually we use a plate solve module. So that plate solving, it's just basically the computer or the control center like the SI Air takes a picture of the star field, it analyzes the stars and it says like, oh yes, you are pointed exactly at this target. And therefore, it can understand where it is pointing at and then recenter your target for you. It's magical. But what happens if the plate solving doesn't fail, but gives a false result? It tells the mount like, oh, you're pointed at these coordinates, but those coordinates are wrong. The mount has to accept it. Actually, some drivers, like EQ mod, do not so easily accept that. If they are told to accept that they're pointing at coordinates that are really far away from where the mount thinks it is pointing, it will reject those coordinates and will say like, no, that's a lie. I don't listen to you, plate solving software. But a lot of drivers, they'll just like eat that up and say like, oh, really? I'm actually pointing there. Okay, got it. But if it's wrong, then the mount doesn't actually know its physical pointing diagram. Let's say it thinks that it's pointing right above the horizon when it's actually right close to the meridian. And then maybe it will go past the meridian limit because it doesn't think that it's pointed anywhere close to the meridian. So that's where bad things, very bad things can happen. It's very rare that this happens, but it absolutely can happen, especially for longer focal length telescopes, where there are fewer stars in the field of view to take into account, and where a false positive like that can happen. And it has happened to me in the past. And that's one of the reasons why, especially for long focal length, I do not use ASCOM, because that's where I got my false positives effectively, but I use Plate Solve 3.8 to do that. And I have not seen Plate Solve 3.8 give me false positives, at least for now, knock on wood. So that's the very underwhelming conclusion. Set your meridian limits and also your horizon and zenith limit if you wish to. But it may not be enough. If you're unlucky, you could still have trouble and you could still get your hardware damaged. And I've seen a video, and one of my Patreon supporters, I think, told me about that. And I couldn't find it again, that comment and that video. So I'm really sorry about that, where someone actually set up a physical fuse on the mount to prevent, even if the mount doesn't understand exactly where it's pointed at, even if it's been lied to by the control software, it could actually go further than the mount limit, but then it would hit that fuse and lose power. Therefore, you remove that risk. And so I feel that's something it would be really nice to have kind of as part of the mount, to have this physical limits in addition to the software limits, because as we saw, those software limits are fallible. What are your thoughts? Have you had trouble with your mount limits? Let me know down in the comments if you have tips and tricks, or if you know the link to that video I mentioned with the physical limits on the mount. Let us know down in the comments. While you're at it, click that like button. It takes a second. It really helps the channel out. And if you want to support more at no cost to you, planning on buying any equipment from Amazon, Agena, High Point Scientific, First Light Optics, astroshop.eu, and all of those good places. If you do so after clicking the links that I have in the description, it will help me out. Small, but still good. If you want to help more directly, you can join my Patreon as a supporter or join my channel as a member. That's the join button next to the subscribe button. You guys make the channel possible. I wouldn't be making videos anymore if it weren't for you, and thank you so much for your generosity. With that, I hope this was useful. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget, whenever you can, to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.